Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, Chief Storymaker and your host of this podcast. We share stories for many reasons. We want to persuade, we want to entertain, and we want to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're being perceived by the people you're sharing them with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you and you'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into lessons from each of those stories. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? Well, when I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, but not to respond necessarily. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your related stories, and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. My guest today on podcast Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, is Ronan Leonard, fascinating man living in Australia, near Melbourne, and just incredible stories from his past, and I'm excited to dig in. So welcome, Ronan. How are you?
I'm very well, Sarah. Thank you for having me on your show.
Absolutely. So I always start with one question for my guest. I ask to share something that people generally wouldn't know about you, something that we wouldn't see on your resume or anywhere on LinkedIn necessarily. And the reason I do that is so that our listeners get a better feel for who you are, so they feel more connected to you as we get into your story.
Okay, I'm not quite sure how connected they're going to be after this story, but I once got threatened by somebody with a machete. I was caught in bed with his sister in his parents' bed. I was in my early 20s, and this was in South Africa, and he took offense to that and threatened me with a machete. So that was a very scary time in my life.
Gosh.
And I'm sharing that with your audience. So.
Oh my gosh, that is a new one. That's one I haven't heard yet in all these episodes. Threatened your life with a machete. That is terrifying.
Yes, it was. Yeah, so it was very much coitus interruptus.
So what did she say?
There was this whole bizarre story afterwards. I was dropped off there by these friends I met, and then he had this machete to me, and I said, go and call my friend. And this was about 5 a.m. And she came back and said, I called the house and they're sleeping. And I said, you need to go back and explain the situation. I didn't want to say, that your brother's here with a machete to me. You need to explain exactly what's happening here. And she said, oh, okay then. So she went back and called them. So yeah, very, very bizarre happening. And it just got more and more bizarre. My friends came, which was a woman and her husband, and this other guy came to help. At the same time, they called her parents who were staying close by. They came and they started asking me if I wanted to come to tea that afternoon, what were my intentions to their daughter, all this really bizarre. Yeah, it was a really,
wow.
really strange thing. So yes, I got threatened with a machete.
And then, did you think he would actually use it?
Initially, I did, yes. I mean, eventually he sort of calmed down. But yeah, the first part, I thought, this is my numbers up here.
Oh my gosh, that is so scary.
So yeah, from being threatened with a machete to them saying, "What are your intentions for our daughter?" Like I think they thought I was going to marry her or something. And then when they got a little bit upset about me not wanting to go and catch them, I said, "Well, let's talk about, your son threatening a machete." And they went, "Oh yeah, okay then." So yeah, it was an extremely, extremely bizarre situation.
Wow. Well, when you marry the girl, you marry the family.
Exactly. And I married someone else, luckily enough.
Oh, good. Wow, that's a good one. I'm not sure how to follow that. Well, we'll just dig right in then.
Sure.
I'm fascinated by your work in that you create these niche mastermind groups for small businesses so that they can really work with other people that are in similar situations, brainstorm ideas. And it's kind of like
niche networking, it sounds like to me. So can you just briefly describe what that is before we get into the story behind it?
Yeah, sure. There's two parts to it. So first of all, a lot of subject matter experts don't know what to do with that. So they're really good at what they do. And we know this all the time. You're in your genius zone, and often your clients or the people say, how do you do that? And you dismiss it. Oh, that's easy. That's what I do every day. And what they struggle to do is to then package that up into something that is viable that people want to buy. And this is where the mastermind comes in, is that I teach people that they have a gift, they have things that people want to learn from them, and a shortcut to an outcome that they want. And so instead of them just delivering this outcome all the time, they teach other people, I teach them how to package it up so they can teach other people how to do that in a mastermind. And the key difference between a mastermind and a course is that a course is a lot of content, but without the context. 85% of people don't finish a course, and it's predominantly because they don't know how to apply the information to their actual needs and get the feedback or the nuances between that. And so in a mastermind, you have a group, sometimes up to about 8 people, and they ask the right questions, they get feedback, they get ideas from other people even within the group, and shape that into something that you can actually then go, okay, I get this now. I've taken that information and I'm able to apply it succinctly. So that's what I do. I help people package up their IP.
Wow. I bet that's really useful for people. I was just thinking back on that idea that you have some genius in you and people ask you how you did it and you say, well, doesn't everybody do that? I keep coming back to that sentence in your introduction, and that's brilliant right there. And insightful that there are people who have that and don't know how to apply it. So wow, interesting. So as we dig into this, I'm curious about what gave you this idea. What happened? What was the incident that you said, oh my gosh, people really need this, and I can help and I can develop my own income with it?
Well, the mastermind concept for me started reasonably late in life. I had another previous business that I've run for about 12 years, which was an events-based business. But I look back for key patterns in my life, and this is where the genius sort of thing comes in the fact that we're only good at, most of us only good at one or two things. There are those outliers that are good at everything, and you go, God, I wish I was like that.
Yeah, I love you, but I hate you. Yeah.
Yes. I love what
Yeah,
you
I know
do,
people.
hate that you can do it so easy.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we're good at, tend to be just 2 or 3 things, and that's our genius zone. And some people never ever find it, partly because they're not looking, and they're not looking for those patterns, and again, they dismiss them. So for me, when I was looking to start a new business, because I'd taken my other business as far as I could, and I just I couldn't see myself doing it for the next 4, 5, 10 years. I looked around for patterns in my life, and I literally spent about 18 months looking at what I do, why I do it. And one of the key things for me was the pivotal moment in my life when I worked on a cruise ship and it sunk. And at the time, I was one of the lowest paid people in the shop, in the ship. I worked in the gift shop. And as this drama unfolded, my core innate thing of helping people came out. And I recognized a couple of the patterns as well. When I had my other business, I had a lot of contractors because it was very seasonal work. And people will ask me a little bit about, how do you start your business? How do you do this? And I'm always happy to sort of give advice and share people on with that, because it's a little bit like sort of teachers. The greatest gift you often have is not sharing your riches, but revealing other people's riches, what they're good at. Mm-hmm. And it all sort of coalesced into this idea of masterminds. I was in a mastermind about 4 years ago, absolutely loved it. And then it's like, okay, I think I can do this, and I think I can do this very well. And I think it ties into my genius, my unique ability. And so then as a result, I then just started to sort of teach people how to do this.
So you talked about the patterns that revealed themselves to you. And what is something specific that you did maybe when you were giving that advice, do you remember a specific person that asked you for that advice that then turned around and did something with it? Because the one thing that always drives me crazy is when people ask for my advice and then they don't take it. or they dismiss it. It's not just not taking it, it's completely dismissing it after they've asked for it. So there must have been a specific situation where somebody came to you, you were able to develop that relationship with them where they actually listened to you and then they took it and did something with it.
Yeah, you're right. I've had both sides of that coin. So I had a contractor who was working for me part-time. He was teaching yoga. He had another sort of business. So he was trying to, between them all, he was trying to create an income. And he wanted to be he wanted to own his own yoga studio. And so we talked about setting up a business and the process and a couple of things to get his first sort of runs on the board. And he and his wife set up a yoga studio and a very successful one now that he's done. So that was great to see that all he really wanted, I mean, he had the idea, he had the drive, he had the passion. He probably just wanted that reality check of, can I do this? That sort of fear. Because I often say that all your desires are on the other side of your fear. And it becomes two things. Is your desire stronger than your fear? If it is, you'll probably achieve that. If it isn't, then fear will win and fear will hold you back to say you don't want to do that, or who are you to start that, or you're not good enough, you're not smart enough. That internal fear, that self-doubt that keeps talking to us, that's the thing that stops us doing all those things.
When there are two parts to that, really. I mean, because it's not just that fear stopped you because you were self-conscious or you didn't feel like you could do it. That fear might have stopped you partly because the desire wasn't strong enough.
Yes, yeah.
So maybe that isn't your genius area and there's a reason you're fearful. If you have any common sense at all.
And in answer to your other question about giving advice and people not taking it, is that I'm really good at habits, and I've been going to my local gym for about 8 years, and the gym owner is an absolute subject matter expert. What he doesn't know about gyms isn't worth knowing. His dad was one of those old school strongmen. There's pictures on the wall of him with an elephant stood on his chest, that type of thing from the 40s and the 30s and the 50s.
Right.
Anyway, his gym is tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and I only found it through a third-party website. And we talked about sort of marketing a couple of times, and I'm not really a marketer, but I know more than him. And I talked about him having a WordPress website and getting a bit of SEO done and just sort of boosting his profile. And he's talked about it for 8 years now, and his business is now closing this month because he's run it into the ground. Because he's busy every week. He'd be moving the equipment around. That's in his comfort zone. He'd be buying new equipment, new barbells, all those sorts of things because he's comfortable with that. He wasn't comfortable with marketing and just wouldn't actually even employ someone to do it. He had the money. So there is that two sides of the equation, exactly what you said, where you give people advice and you often, I'm not even a paid consultant for that. I was just genuinely wanted to help him, and he didn't want the help, didn't want to act on it.
I've seen that so many times. It makes me really sad. And at the same time, we can't help everyone, especially those who don't actually help.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's frustrating. I was going to ask, well, if he's doing okay, then it wouldn't matter, but clearly he's not doing okay. But then you come back to that coin, is he not successful because his desire wasn't strong enough to counter the fear of doing something that was out of his comfort zone?
I suppose only he can answer that. It's definitely a sort of tricky one. But we all know this from everything, from public speaking to starting your own podcast. Doesn't matter what it is. There's all this fear and doubt, and who am I to do this? And then when you actually start to do it, you go, most of your fears are unfounded. They're just, it's never as bad as you made it out in your head, and the worst case scenarios and all those sort of things. And and just sort of working through, is this really true? One of the modules in my masterminds is to go through a mindset process of just sort of look at some of your limiting beliefs and look at your fears and your doubts, and ask yourself one of those few simple questions. Is this really true? Because it is what stops us from achieving all these great ideas that we had as a kid or in our early teens or early 20s. And then we build up these walls around us and block ourselves in from reaching these goals that are really important to us, that we tell ourselves that we want.
And I keep coming back to this man who had great inspiration and motivation for his business, but failed because he didn't take on the next steps outside of his comfort zone. And the reason this keeps popping back into my head is I'm always trying to figure out why, and obviously we can't possibly know without talking to him. But one of the things that I find with my coaching clients is that part of that fear gets addressed when they start talking about it. So the trick would be making sure that you are surrounded by people who you can talk to about these things. So my theory is that if he had somebody in his life that he could be talking to that could say, well, what are you afraid of? Why don't you want help? Or why, what is it that is stopping you from developing some sort of a strategy or marketing more? I just keep coming back to the fact that we surround ourselves with the people who are going to make or break our dreams.
Yeah, exactly. That Jim Rohn phrase of the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. When I first heard that, it sounds like an insult. It sounds like, well, you're judging you're judging my friends or even my family or the people I spend time with. But ultimately, it is so true. Some of it comes down to paid versus free. We value what we pay for, and free advice is, for most people, just that. It's free, and therefore it's easy to dismiss. And you talked about being frustrated with giving advice to people and them ignoring it. When they've paid you, though, they're far more likely. People who pay attention, and more they pay, the more attention they pay. So my experience is in paid masterminds is people do open up and they do see that different side, partly because they've paid, partly because one of the key aspects I believe in a mastermind is that safe space to start talking about the fears that you just don't talk to anybody else. You're not going to tell your customers that things aren't going great. You're not going to tell your suppliers. You're not going to tell your staff. So you do need that safe space where you start to talk about your frustrations, your problems, and what you're afraid of. And when you can open up and be that vulnerable, all of a sudden you realize everybody else is the same.
Right. Everyone has fears. Yeah. And it's coming right back to the people that you spend time with. If you've surrounded yourself by other stoic people, then you may not even know what you don't know in terms of reaching out to a mastermind type group or other people who have been in your situation. If you've surrounded yourself with people who are stoic, don't ask questions, or don't open up in any kind of vulnerable way, I think you're even more hesitant to reach out to a group that might behave that way.
Yeah, certainly. We're always a product of our environment, and it's never more true. And I love this phrase, is that if you're in a family of thieves and you don't steal, you're the one that feels guilty.
Right.
Right? Because you're bucking against the norm. This is what everyone's supposed to be doing. We're all supposed to be stealing. So you feel like the odd one out. So exactly, if you're in a group around of people that are, as you said, are pretty stoic, that don't talk about their feelings or about their business or about what's really happening, then they're bucking against the trend. So yeah, you can find the right people that you can share with if that's what you want and if that's what is important to you.
One of my favorite stories that I heard in recent years relating to the people that you surround yourself with was my friend Tom Dietzler, who told me a story about when he was about 16 years old. He had been hanging out with a crowd of boys that were not going to do anything. They were not going to leave their little town. and their hope for any kind of interesting future beyond what they were already doing was pretty slim. And he consciously made the decision to change his group of friends, to talk to other people and develop relationships with people that he thought were more likely to do something with their lives that he would find interesting. And the reason that resonated so strongly with me is that I think about that a lot, about the fact that right now in our time, we have access to people that we would consider celebrities in a way we never had access to them before. So for instance, one of my friends posted something about Wendy's, the burger place, and Wendy's responded. I mean, who knows who represents them for their Twitter account, but this friend of mine tagged Wendy's on a post that was really hilarious, and Wendy's responded. And when you think about that access, it just opens all kinds of doors. We've kind of leveled the playing field in a way that we've never experienced before. That accessibility, which means that we have options in terms of who we surround ourselves with. Even if we live in a tiny town in Montana, we can still be peers and collaborators with somebody that has a big name in some place like New York City.
Yeah, I have a very similar story to your friend. At 18, I worked in the Department of Social Security in the UK, which is basically my job was to write out checks for people who were on Social Security. They were sick. They were long-term sick, effectively unemployed. And I looked around at all the people in the office, and I distinctly remember saying to myself, if I'm here in 5 years' time, just shoot me. Because it was that mentality of, they complained about everything. They had zero ambition, and they were just there, just punching in, day out. And in that environment of government, it's very hard to change those sorts of things. I understand that frustration, but you have two choices. If you can't change it, you move. And I just said, look, this is not me. And I had to get out of there. So I quit. And I've done that with several sort of jobs in my early 20s. I just went, this is not for me. I don't know what I want to do, but I know it's not this. And I know that I'm not settling for this. So yeah, several times I've just, I think I can recall at least 3 times where I've quit my job pretty much and left within a week and said, this just isn't for me. I'll find something else because this isn't it.
Right. So when you were at the Social Security office, did you recognize that by staying there and being kind of included in that group of people who were comfortable government employees, that you had to find other people to spend time with in order to expose yourself to other things? Did you know that at the time?
I did, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I looked at all the people there, and I just thought, I've got nothing in common with pretty much any of these people. I don't want to be like this, because they were all ingrained into the way of complaining and let's do as little work as possible, but then at the same time let's complain about everything. So I just looked around and this is not my tribe, for want of a better word. Right. These are just not the people that. And I don't want to be that person. And so yeah, I made that conscious decision to say, I've got to get out of here because I'm afraid this could be me in 20 years' time that I've done that for.
So what did you do first thing when you stepped out of there?
Oh, I got another job where I got employed, and I thought it was a permanent contract, and I started that morning, and they said, oh, actually, this is just a temporary contract. And I said, well, I've just quit my other job. So that didn't work out too well. But I also moved. Then a year later, I moved cities. Then 2 years later, I moved again down to London. And I just kept on looking for something and saying, okay, this isn't it. Thought it might be, but it isn't. Let me try something else. So I had a bit of a wanderlust, and I just kept sort of looking. Like I said, I had no idea what I wanted to do. As I tried several things, I just realized that was what I didn't want to do.
That is funny. I just had a conversation with somebody, with two different people, with two totally different contexts in terms of conversation, about that aspect of our lives, that knowing what your deal breakers are can often be more valuable than having a list of what you want, of what you think you want. So whether you're talking about a relationship or a job or even a dog, if you're picking out a pet, knowing what your deal breakers are really narrows things down so you can make decisions, but still leaves things wide open, because you can't possibly say, I don't want everything, because
Mm.
you just don't know. But if you have a list of the things you do want, then other opportunities that might fall into your lap, you may dismiss because it's not on your list.
Yeah, that's a good one. I've used that once or twice before, where you do reverse of goal setting. It's almost like an anti-goal. You look at the things that you don't want, and they do help then shape what you do want. Because ultimately, we have, especially in the Western world, we have a myriad of options, choices, things we could do. As you said, it's quite a level playing field these days. Your options are almost limitless, which creates some kind of paralysis sometimes, and also it creates either a FOMO or even a goal that you set that isn't really what you want. Because most people think that
Right.
it's all about money. Most people think that they want to be millionaires. Um, Once you've been in business for a while, and that's the sucker dream that people on YouTube sell to 20-year-olds, that
Right.
the Ferrari and the mansion and the yacht.
Right.
You talk to people in their 30s and the 40s who are actually running a business, and their pure motivation is that they love what they do, that they love helping customers, that they want to serve more customers, and the money is just a byproduct. So sometimes
Right.
figuring out what you don't want really helps you to actually work towards what you end up, what you really love to do.
Definitely. I remember when I talked to my husband after one of our dogs died, and I told him I didn't want another dog. I said, no way, I'm not doing this again. And he convinced me later on, less than a year after we lost the dog, which I was still heartbroken, which is part of why I didn't want another one. But he convinced me to go to the Humane Society and consider adopting a dog. And the night before we went over there, I said to him, here are my deal breakers. I don't want a small dog, because if we're going to get a dog, I want a dog that can protect us, because we actually had a burglary of our house 3 years ago that was terrifying. So I didn't want a tiny dog. I wouldn't mind a medium size. I said, and I don't want a dog that is going to shed so badly that I'm spending all my time cleaning my clothes, getting hair off of my clothes and the couch. And other than that, I was pretty open, but I knew what my deal breakers were. I also knew I didn't want a dog that was under 2 years old, because of my experience with other dogs. And it's fascinating, because we went the next day to the Humane Society, and my husband had picked out 3 dogs to look at. And one of them is this huge chocolate lab mix. He's at the time he was about 109 pounds. And as the other dogs started barking, because people started walking into the kennels, he started barking, and the room shook when he barked. It was just this huge, scary bark. And of course, I beelined for him. But my husband said, that's the one I think we need. So we took him outside on the lead and took him for a little bit of a walk. And the Humane Society had named him Toblerone, like the chocolate.
Yes.
And they were calling him Toby. And we walked around the lot, and I wasn't convinced he was the right dog for us. But I did notice that when I pet him, I didn't get a lot of hair on me. So I thought, oh my gosh, he's not really shedding. By the way, that was wrong. It was an incorrect assessment. But at the time, it seemed like he wasn't really shedding. He had a huge bark, and he was mostly a very gentle dog. So because I didn't have a list of things that I wanted about a dog, I was open to a dog that otherwise I might have dismissed. So we ended up taking him home that day, and he's been with us since March 8th. And
Yeah.
this is mid-September. And he is so sweet and such a good protector. And when he barks, the whole house shakes. and strangers don't come to our door without putting their hand up, like, don't let the dog out, and which is wonderful. And yet, again, I just keep coming back to this. If I had had this list of wants, none of those dogs would have filled it.
Yeah. It's a good philosophy, and it's an interesting concept that I suppose many people probably aren't aware of, or haven't sort of haven't tried in the past. But yeah, I've tried it a couple of times, and you're right. It's a great way of being open to possibilities, but at least having some parameters around that decision making.
Mm-hmm. And I think as we get older and have more and more experience, we learn more about what our deal breakers are. And everybody's deal breakers are going to be different, I think, and especially depending on the circumstances. So one last story from you. I heard some of your story about the ship and the fact that you were a hero, that you rescued people. And what I'm curious about is the after. When all was done, and people can read about this, about your story, on the website. I will have an associated blog post with this podcast on the elkinsconsulting.com website, so that you can, we'll have a link to Ronan's story so that you can read about it and understand, have a little bit more context for my question right now. I'm really curious about afterward, when you got home and the whirlwind of activity was over. What happened? What did you do? And how did you process what happened?
I think because it happened at such a young age, I pretty much dismissed it. It was something that happened, and it happened to me, and that was it. So I do remember the first couple of days afterwards, every beer tastes like the best beer in the world. Every food tastes amazing. So there is that near-death experience, heightens your senses. Absolutely, I can testify to that worked.
Gratitude, for sure.
Yeah,
Right.
But very quickly, I pretty much dismissed it. I used a lot of the fun things that happened at the time in anecdotes and stories that I tell at parties and things. So I actually, as perverse as this sounds, it was actually quite a fun experience, almost right the way through. And that's probably just partly me. I don't know. It's probably part of the fact that I didn't panic. Nobody died.
You didn't die. Right.
Yeah, nobody died, which was more luck than anything else. It certainly wasn't planned that way. It could have turned out far, far worse if the ship had sunk slower, because effectively we still had 170 people on board, myself included, and no lifeboats left, and in this huge storm. And although there were ships around us, none could get near, because you're talking 100-mile-an-hour winds, 60-foot swells, the size of a 3-4 story house. It was pretty intense. But again, afterwards, to answer your question, I don't know. I really didn't process it in any kind of official way. I wasn't traumatized. I wasn't harping back to it. I just sort of moved on my life sort of quite quickly, and I went back to work on cruise ships for another 9 years, and it got to the point where, so the last four years when I worked for ships, I worked for Royal Caribbean Cruise Line, and they had this safety video for people to join the ship, and this was not what to do, and they used the video of the Oceanus sinking, and there's pictures of me in the video helping people, and my future wife joined a ship. We went to join another ship. We met on another ship. Went to join the ship. She joined about 4 weeks before me, and I was home in the UK. And she called me from San Diego and said, "I just joined the ship a couple of days ago. I saw this safety video, and there was this guy that just like you on this ship that's sinking." I said, "Yeah, that was me." So we'd been together about 6 months or so, and I hadn't even told her
that I
worked on the ship that sunk. So that's how I processed it and viewed it. People go, "Oh yeah, I saw you on that ship that sank," on the safety video, so they knew me from that. But effectively, it didn't really define me. Probably my key lesson out of it was that I really learned to push back on authority a little bit. We all automatically defer to experts, but people in authority, and that's what we're sort of conditioned to do. And even online, this social phenomenon is that someone's got 200,000 followers on Twitter, they must have something interesting to say, even if they
we know that
haven't.
that's not the case.
No,
but
it's
yes,
just that social proof. Oh, they've got 2
there's a
million followers.
temptation, right?
Yeah.
To believe them, right?
So what it taught me was that I had to push back, because the captain was an absolute coward. The chief engineer went in the first lifeboat. So we loaded women and children in the first lifeboat on the one side, and then on the other side, most of the senior officers and crew left without a single passenger on there. They all just left.
Oh my gosh, that's disgusting.
So what it taught me is that, and interestingly enough, about a week before, I almost got fired because I had a run-in with the captain, and he accused me of doing something that I hadn't done, quite trivial, don't sit on the bar stools. And I went, no, I didn't sit on them. And I thought I was going to get fired. So it taught me that just because you're the captain of a ship or you're the CEO of something, you've still got to earn respect, and people shouldn't automatically give all their trust and support in someone just because they have a title. They've still got to earn that trust. And that was probably my sort of key life lesson that I took out of that.
I'm glad you learned that so young. Because otherwise you might not have shifted jobs and found what you are magical at. So back to, just briefly, back to the processing of this story. It's on your LinkedIn profile, and it became not part of your identity, but definitely part of your brand. So what was the trigger? What happened in your life in recent years that made you go back to that story and realize that this was part of what shaped you, even if at the time and even 5 to 10 years later, you didn't necessarily see it in that role in your life?
It came down to the intentionality of looking at what I wanted to do next and where my genius zone is. And like I said, I pretty much dismissed all of that for close to 20 years. And it's just something that happened to me, as opposed to sort of picking it apart.
Right.
I also, funny enough, I was taught by a business coach to another way of finding out of picking your genius is that you email all your friends and you ask them why they're your friends, and you give them a few parameters around there, but it certainly opens you up to being quite vulnerable and also getting an insight into you that you don't have. I think a lot of people, we're just not aware of what we're really good at. We do tend to lack a little bit of self-awareness.
Oh, definitely.
So we see ourselves as one person, and the world sees us as something else.
And I just have to interrupt you for a second, because that's something I talk about a lot in terms of your personal brand, in that I believe that especially when you're younger, there's a huge gap between your perception of yourself and other people's perception of you. And with living more intentionally, you shrink that gap as you are more intentional about the values that you're demonstrating in the world around you. But okay, go on.
Yes, and I'd agree with that. I think there is this point where we see ourselves sometimes as the person we want to be, and we're not there yet. We're aspiring to be that person. But you either recognize there's a gap and deal with that, and that's that self-awareness, or you delude yourself and think that I'm already that person, and in reality you're not, because people are seeing you completely different.
Right.
So I took the time to gather all those sort of life stories, things that happened to me, where I feel I've made an impact, where I feel I can make an impact, where I've enjoyed doing things, those 4 levels of competence. And you ultimately want to be in that unconscious competence where you just do something and it comes to you naturally. That's that flow they talk about. So I was looking to find more flow in my life, but trying to unpick the process and trying to find my own genius, because at certain stages I think I'd sort of got close, but there are times when I feel I'm so far from it, and that's some of those jobs where you don't have to be a rocket scientist to look there and go, this job is terrible pay, the people are idiots, I need to leave. So it's a
Right.
combination of all of those things, and life lessons and mistakes of all sort of coming together, but taking the time to work it out. I read last year this great book that talked about, especially for people in their early 20s, you're effectively going to work for about 40 years. So even if you spent 2 years trying to figure out what you really wanted, that's nothing. If you're going to spend the next 38 doing what you absolutely love and nailing that 2-year experiment of taking the time instead of just taking a job because you have to, or jumping into an industry because you feel it's hot or there's going to be money in it, that 2 years can give you 38 years of an amazing career. So
So
it's worth taking the time.
I have a question though, because I have theories about that. Can you really know in your early 20s? I mean, no matter how much digging you do, unless you've experienced different things, I'm not sure you can, even if you spent 2 years doing it, I can tell you that what I was good at, or what I thought I was good at, or what I dug into between 20 and 25 was completely different from where I am now. And then the next part of that is, let's say that my suggestion would be that you take a month every 5 years as opposed to 2 years at a time to reassess and dig back into what your experience has been and apply those lessons to your next 5 years. What do you think of that?
I'm not saying that you will spend 38 years in the same career doing that.
Right, of course not. No.
It's more around spending a couple of years, again, working on different skill sets, trying to bridge that gap between where you think you are and where you actually are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, emotionally,
and finding your strengths.
And finding your strengths and dialing into them and amplifying those. And those strengths will definitely change. Like you said, anything from you didn't know that you could sing until you're over 40. So there are definitely sort of things that will come out that you didn't know, but
have the confidence to explore.
Yeah, but spending that time to dig into those and being a bit more intentional and looking for your deeper intrinsic motivation instead of the superficial ones will pay off in spades, rather than just sort of thinking this next shiny object, or I really want to do that because it'll pay me $100,000 a year, whatever that is.
I would love to see more young people going through that process of, first of all, figuring out what their strengths are and what they love, because sometimes you're really good at things you don't like doing, but also digging into what they really think success looks like. And because you're right, I see so many people and of every age that don't assess what they think success looks like, because they're just going with what their peers or the celebrities are doing in terms of what they think, well, that looks successful to me, so that's what I'm going to go toward.
Yeah, it's definitely a false definition of success for so many people. You know, I don't want to own a yacht and have 4 houses and fly around the world. No interest whatsoever. But we're all sold that story, and you know how many millions of people watch the Kardashians and think that that's a great lifestyle. Certainly not for me. And I think if they had it, they'd realize what a train wreck it is for them. But yeah, the point is, that intrinsic value, that key core drivers, what you really love to do, what sort of floats your boat, is something that so few of us spend the time to do. And I probably didn't do enough of it. You know, it was only as I got older that I did that. So yeah, I'd wish I'd done it at a younger age. Absolutely, I at least knew what I didn't want, so that helped.
Yes.
You know, with the quitting of the job. So I was halfway there. I just didn't spend enough time figuring out what I did want to do. I just spent so much time going, I don't want to do this.
Yes, well, you had to go through that to get to where you are now, and I think most people do. So even if we could get more people to stop at younger ages and think about those things, I'm not sure. Just like I didn't listen to my parents, they're not going to listen to us. and they're going to think they know everything until they get to our age. And then they'll say, oh, wow, I really didn't know anything, and I still don't know anything. And so that's really fascinating to me, that it took that intentional time after your 12-year run with that business to stop and look back and realize that that story from when you were a kid really did have an impact, even if at the time and for 20 years you kind of dismissed it as being not necessarily a pivot point in your life, but it really was.
Yes, because I wanted to start another business, because I don't think I'm employable, to be honest. I think, don't think I've got the employable skill sets anymore. But I didn't want to make money for the sake of it, and that's the sort of core thing. I think that's why a lot of small businesses fail these days, because people go into business thinking it's all about making money, and it's not. And that's the last thing I would do. Why would I want to start a business and it'd be the same as working for someone else? If you don't sort of believe in it, why would I have a business that I hate, that just makes money?
That's something my friend Kurt Mercadante talks about a lot, that if you get into that mindset that you end up working for yourself, but you just hired yourself, which isn't really the point. That's not the solution that you were looking for.
Yeah. So that's why I spent that time on the solution, because the last thing I want to do is to start another business and get a couple of years into it and go, I hate this.
Right.
It doesn't matter how much or how little money I make, but I hate that. So that intentionality of trying to design a life that fulfills you and you enjoy, and that's a far better measure of success than to say, okay, well, I've got this yacht and I've got this mansion, but I don't like any of it.
But I'm miserable, right?
Yeah.
I'm still fascinated by the story, and at some point I'd like to dig in a little deeper. Maybe if we can meet face to face sometime over a beer or something, because I'm really curious about that processing. Because what I find is that the clients that I work with pick out those experiences like what you're talking about on the ship, and they didn't realize how much it impacted the way they view the world or the decisions they made following that experience, until we start talking about it. And it's interesting to hear people process things that happened so long ago. And I realized through my coaching with the communication coaching and storytelling that I am kind of a slow processor, and I make quick decisions, and I'm pretty impulsive sometimes. But when it comes down to experiences, it can take me weeks or even months to process what I learned or what I experienced, and really get down to the details of how that impacted how I think. And so I would love to dig into that some more, and maybe even find out some of the surrounding stories from that time in your life, because I don't think it was all by itself. I think there's a lot more to it.
I feel like you want to sit me down on the couch and
I kind of do. Only because I know that these stories would be fascinating, and it would be helpful to others to hear some of them and how you processed it. And also for you, I mean, I love telling somebody a story that I had long forgotten, and somebody triggers a memory and I share a story, and it helps me process things in a totally different light. And I love that. It's kind of a magical feeling when that light bulb comes on. Oh, that's how that happened.
Yeah. Well, again, you're operating in your genius zone, so that's a good place to be in.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Ronan, for taking the time and doing this recording with me. The time difference is really interesting between Melbourne and Montana. And so I appreciate your figuring out how to make this work for recording for this podcast. So thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you for having me on as a guest, Sarah, and just sharing my humble little story about me.
Oh, humble. Yes. Well, our listeners can find out more information about Ronan Leonard on the blog post associated with the podcast at elkinsconsulting.com.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?